tomorrow. When what could actually happen is the other way around.
Well, and there's been assassinations in Iran. There's been all kinds of provoking. We're flying drones into Iran that are being captured and I guess retrofitted or re-engineered by the Iranians. So, you know, we're not doing anything to really help. It doesn't seem we're doing anything to help this kind of peace process, or maybe we are trying to play both sides is what it looks like.
Look, it's very complicated because the Obama strategy, the way he's been selling it is it's basically lots of sticks, and if the sticks work, there will be some carrots afterwards, which in diplomatic language, in fact, a lot of people, including myself, we have interpreted this as the roll over and die diplomatic strategy. You know, Iran has to accept everything that the U.S. says that they have to do, and then we're going to start discussing about alleviating some sanctions, not extinguishing the sanctions. And Iran is saying, no, we sit at the table, we propose something, you propose something, we get a deal, and then the sanctions are out of the picture. Because then we will prove to you that this is only a civilian program. And there's absolutely no, these sanctions are meaningless. And this, so far, the Bush administration, of course, and then the Obama administration, they haven't listened to this line of thought. And now they're probably reevaluating their possibilities, especially because what we just mentioned, the possibility of an electoral gain for Obama if a deal is actually reached, you know.
Well, and then how does this tie in with the NATO summit in Chicago? I don't know if you've been reading in American papers, but they've created evacuation plans for the citizens to move out of Chicago. They're not going to allow any protests. They've got missiles on tops of roofs with shoot-to-kill orders and no-fly zones. I mean, it is like they're turning, you know, Chicago into Baghdad almost. And
in fact, exactly. Maybe this is an exercise of NATO turning Chicago into Kabul of Baghdad, and see if their new techniques are going to work in an urban environment, considering that they don't work in Afghanistan, right? Against Taliban or Pashtun organized guerrilla. This is completely absurd. You know, first of all, what is NATO going to do in Chicago? Basically, they're going to say what they said at their latest summit in Lisbon in late 2010, which is basically, we are the new global Robocop, the global cop. We follow United Nations Supreme Council, Security Council mandate, or maybe we can even bypass it if the US tells us to do so. NATO, we should never forget, NATO is the European arm of the Pentagon. So everything that NATO does, well or not well, depends on the Pentagon. Why NATO won the war in Libya? Because Obama signed an executive order in June last year ordering the Pentagon to transfer to NATO all the best satellite and all sorts of intel that NATO didn't have access from their bases in southern Italy. Then they won the war in the next months, basically. Until then, they were a bunch of incompetent drones, which what they are, basically. You know, so without Pentagon guidance, NATO is nothing. In Afghanistan, most European countries, including France, by the way, which Hollande has already said that he's taking all French soldiers out of Afghanistan by the end of 2012. And most European countries, they also think Afghanistan is a tremendous black hole. It has nothing to do with them, and they want out. They you know, informally and off the record, they say, this is an American problem. It's not our problem. We have our German, Italian, French troops attacked everywhere that we were posted. We're not making any progress. If we leave or we don't leave, this civil war inside Afghanistan will go on forever. So, you know, it's up to the Americans to solve this problem. So NATO is losing a war in Afghanistan. They won a war in Libya, which was also an AFRICOM war. That's the Pentagon African arm. That's also very important.
Libya is actually, that's the stepping stone into Africa, essentially. Because now they're talking about going into Sudan. We've got this made-up war against Coney.
Right.
You know, there's
so
plenty of ways.
You know, it could be, the pretext could be Coney. There are already special forces in that very sensitive triangle because there's lots of oil and minerals. Uganda, Congo, Central African Republic.
We're not there for that, though. We're there for a warlord that hasn't been seen in 6 years. That's why we're there, Pepe. Remember that.
A warlord that disappeared into the jungle 2 or 3 years ago, in fact.
Yeah.
You know, Kone is gone. Nobody even knows where he is, you know. And he's left with maybe 200, 250 guerrillas. It's constant in the jungle. You know, they don't have access to weapons for that matter. So this thing is over. It's practically over. But of course, we need we in the West always need a pretext when we go to black countries or brown peoples, as my friend Vijay Prashad usually calls most of the third world, right? So that's still the problem. But in terms of AFRICOM, now they can have, if they want, tomorrow, in fact, a base in Libya. Probably in eastern Libya, in Cyrenaica. NATO is controlling the Mediterranean, almost everything except Syria and Lebanon. But they are on their way. Sooner or later, they'll find a way to get into Syria. Not now, because they are trying to sabotage the Kofi Annan plan. So it's going to take a few more weeks or months, you know. But then if this thing doesn't work, NATO will find a way to get into Syria. So NATO is, for all practical purposes, the global police. It started in Yugoslavia, went to Afghanistan, Libya, and, you know, via AFRICOM, which is married to NATO in a sense because they share the Mediterranean. They will be in Central Africa soon in large numbers. So this is what they'll be talking about in Chicago. And expect these lofty declarations by NATO Secretary General Rasmussen, which is an absolutely lousy Danish politician, mediocre. You know, his limelight was to become Secretary General of NATO. And the Russians, very, very important. There is a mechanism inside NATO called the NATO-Russia Council. They meet periodically, and obviously they clash because the Russians say, look, when are you going to stop trying to invade our borders or to put missiles in Georgia or in the Ukraine or whatever? So, but at least they're still discussing. Russia won't be in Chicago. This is not a very good sign. Why? Among other reasons, because NATO is going to discuss the expansion of the missile defense system. And this means missiles in Turkey, which is part of NATO, the eastern arm of NATO. Possibilities of Georgia getting even more integrated into NATO. NATO troops are in Georgia all the time. I was discussing this with the Georgian last week, in fact. So for all practical purposes, Georgia is already attached, is a kind of annex to NATO. And the Russians are fuming. And guess who's back in town as president as of today, Monday? Vladimir Putin, which, as we all remember, destroyed any possibility of Georgia becoming an actual part of NATO in that 2008 war. We all remember that.
All right.
So Putin against NATO is going to be something really, really hardcore to watch over the next few months. And supposing that Obama is reelected, over the next 2 or 3 years as well. If we have Mitt Romney as president, then the clash between NATO and Russia will be so blatant, considering that many of Romney's advisors still refer to Russia as the Soviet Union. so we all know what could happen afterwards.
Well, and as long as they keep the specter of Al-Qaeda alive, and in every one of those cases you mentioned with NATO going in, they always were going in and using Al-Qaeda as the pretext to start these wars. They would send those guys in, start up a bunch of trouble, and then go in as under the guise of humanitarian aid and just start wiping people out and bombing people with depleted uranium. And
exactly. And you know, and Al-Qaeda nowadays, in practice, according to our best sources in Pakistan, there are no more than 60 or 7 Al-Qaeda trainers. And they're not even in Afghanistan anymore. So there are no Al-Qaedas left in Afghanistan. They are all in the Waziristans, north and south. So for all practical purposes, what the Bush administration used to say, we are involved in a global war on terror against terrorists. This is over. Yeah. It was never a global network of terrorists. It was always a small group of maximum 200 or 300. And nowadays there are 50 or 60. And they have simply no capability to mount anything. No, not even in, it's starting with the region, with the confluence between Central Asia and South Asia, Southwest Asia, the Middle East, not to mention the West or the United States. So this is complete bullshit.
Totally, I agree. And what happens is anytime, NATO needs something to go bully up another country they want to invade, they send that Al-Qaeda troop or contingent in there, they back them, they supply them with weapons, and they call it peace.
Exactly. It's just like the FBI organizing the Fast and the Furious plot.
Yeah.
It's the same modus. It's exactly the same modus operandi.
Well, we had a new one last week. They had an FBI informant who got a bunch of crackheads who were working for him on these rental properties. And this guy started agitating him up, saying, "Hey, let's go bomb a bridge. Let's go bomb a bridge. I know the guy to get the explosives from. Hey, we could keep him here in my apartments that I'm running. He was a super for some of these apartments." And then they go and arrest these kids for being terrorists, and they're like, "Oh, anarchists were plotting to destroy this bridge." And you look at these guys, just a bunch of goofballs who probably got some free beer, some free drugs, and okay, yeah, let's do it. Why not? Let's do it. Well, we're mad at the government.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean that you got, and so that's a microcosm of what happens all over the world with Al-Qaeda. You got the FBI creating them here in the U.S. and then NATO using Al-Qaeda to ferment itself in other countries where it wants to go.
Absolutely. And Rob, I think a lot of people in the U.S. remember, it was in 2005, I think, where the Pentagon was saying that Al-Qaeda had a base in the triple border between Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. So I went there to do a report at the time. The only Al-Qaedas that I found were Lebanese businessmen selling plasma TVs and laughing about this absolutely stupidity by the Pentagon, But they can do it all over the world. Whenever they feel there is a strategic price, it could be oil, it could be gas, it could be deposing a government. In the case of South America, it could be water. Mm-hmm. The coming water wars. They will keep using Al-Qaeda as a pretext. There's no question. Sure.
Well, and there's a giant, I think it's in Paraguay, there's a giant reservoir that the Bushes bought a bunch of land back in as President Bush was leading office. They own a bunch of land on top of that. So
yes, it's the largest freshwater reservoir underground in the world. It's called the Guarani Aquifer, in fact. Mm-hmm. It's part of Paraguay, part of Argentina, and part of Brazil. And the South Americans have been talking about this for years because they're like, sooner or later,